Hey everyone, this is going to be a somewhat long video because, like I've said, if you followed any of the other previous uh, audio recordings I've done of this book, The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2, The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, um, I was, like, in the past chapters, like, the pieces really kind of, like, bounced off to each other and kind of, like, were kind of, like, seemed better together than as like standalone pieces, especially considering some of the pieces in there would be like like a page long. And so I've decided that I was gonna record uh, instead of where I read the last volume of this book, I read all the pieces like just individually. This time I'm gonna read the chapters that all the collected primary sources are in. Um, that being, what else do I have to say? Is there anything important that I need to say? No. This is Chapter 7 of The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 2. The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, edited by Sean Matt Gomna. This is Chapter 7, and Chapter 7 is titled Stalinist Russia, Degenerated Worker State or Exploitative Class Society. And here's a little introduction to the piece. This exchange in 1944 was the main one in the formative period of the 1940s in which the Orthodox explicitly debated the nature of the USSR with the heterodox. It came after Shachtman's, quote, heterodox and Trotskyist, end quote, group published an English translation of Trotsky's The New Course with a long commentary by Shachtman. That was Shachtman's reply to In Defense of Marxism. Harry Braverman, who lived from 1920 to 1976, pen name Frankel, is best known today as the author of the book Labor and Monopoly Capital. From 1937 to 1953, he was a member of the, quote, Orthodox Trotskyist, end quote, organization led by James P. Cannon. Then in 1953 split away with a faction characterized by the Socialist Workers' Party leaders as pro-Stalinists. Harry Braverman became a central figure in the magazine Monthly Review. Yeah, Harry Braverman's a huge figure, who I don't know much about, other than that he wrote the book that was stated above. The first piece is labeled Property Forms Define the Worker State. It's by Harry Braverman, 1944. And, sorry, I'm going to the bottom of it to see what it was originally titled as. I guess this was the original title, in fact, and it was published in the Fourth International, May 1944, the periodical Fourth International. The collection of articles entitled The New Course was Trotsky's opening gun in the struggle against the Stalinist bureaucracy. In 1923, the year of the writing of these articles, the Russian Bolshevik Party was passing through a profound internal crisis. It was not the first struggle inside the Bolshevik Party, which had grown and developed through many previous internal disputes over questions of program, strategy, and tactics. The 1923 conflict, however, differed from all the previous ones in culminating in the triumph not of the proletarian Leninist tendency, but the Stalinist tendency of capitulation to alien class influences that were pressing heavily upon the party. After 1923, the European revolutionary wave began to recede, leaving as a deposit mood. Sorry, I gotta reread that last sentence. The 1923 conflict, however, differed from all the previous conflicts in culminating in the triumph not of the proletarian Leninist tendency, but the Stalinist tendency of capitulation to alien class influences that were pressing heavily upon the party. After 1923, the European revolutionary wave began to recede, leaving as a deposit moods of pessimism, exhaustion, and despair which enveloped the proletarian vanguard and which found their expression through the weakest section of the party. It was in this atmosphere that Stalinist vice began to close upon the Bolshevik Party, squeezing out its democratic life and transforming it into an instrument of the narrow, opportunist, and eventually counter-revolutionary clique of Stalin. It was this growing bureaucratization of the party against which Trotsky took up the cudgels in 1923. With the new course, Trotsky began his fight lasting for almost 2 decades against the degeneration of the first worker state. A new edition of this famous series of articles has been put on sale by Max Shachtman, who deserted Trotskyism and broke with the Trotskyist movement in 1940. Attached to Trotsky's 112-page classic, there is a 128-page quote, explanatory end quote, document by Shachtman. We have here another instance of that common current black market device, the tie-in sale, which compels a buyer to purchase inferior, shoddy, or worthless goods in order to obtain the articles he really desires. In order to get beef these days, a working-class housewife is often obliged to buy tripe as well. Trotsky's essays supply Marxist insight and are a matchless example of consistent and principled polemic. Shachtman's essay is the antipode. It is tripe. One reads occasionally in the Stalinist or Social Democratic press that there are, quote, 2 Trotskyist papers, end quote, or, quote, 2 wings, end quote, of the Trotskyist movement in this country. This deliberate misrepresentation is akin to references often made in the bourgeois press to, quote, 2 kinds of communism, end quote. In reality, of course, there is only one, quote, kind of communism, end quote, just as there is only one party in this country that teaches and applies the program of Trotskyism. Trotsky himself made sure in his lifetime that there would be no confusion on this point. On more than one occasion, Trotsky took the opportunity to explain what Trotsky thought of Shachtman's politics and program. Quote, "Our old Mensheviks were real heroes in comparison with them," end quote, he wrote of the Shachtmanites. After the split with the petty bourgeois opposition led by Burnham and Shachtman, Trotsky took particular pains to clarify his attitude towards these people. Trotsky wrote, quote, "Only the other day Shachtman referred to himself in the press as a, quote, Trotskyist, end quote. If this be Trotskyism, then I, at least, am no Trotskyist, ... Had conscious agents of the class enemy operated through Shachtman, they could not have advised Shachtman to do anything different from what he himself has perpetrated," end quote. No one can deny Shachtman the right to abandon Trotsky's ideas, any more than ex-colleague Burnham could be denied the right to abandon the socialist movement. After he, together with Shachtman, split with American Trotskyism, the, quote, right, end quote, of betrayal and regeneracy has always been freely exercised by petty bourgeois intellectuals, particularly in periods of reaction. But then they should not masquerade, like Shachtman, in the trappings of Trotskyism while propagating the polar opposite of the program of Trotskyism. Lenin pointed out that the enemies and opponents of the great Marxist teachers have invariably sought after their death to, quote, emasculate and vulgarize the real essence of their revolutionary theories and to blunt their revolutionary edge, end quote. Shachtman is merely another recruit to this legion of emasculators, vulgarizers, and falsifiers. With typical impudence, Shachtman pretends that Trotsky's class analysis of the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state, quote, is not even a decisively important part, end quote, of Trotskyism. This is like saying that a man could function without a heart. In addition, Shachtman states, quote, our criticism of Trotsky's later theory of the, quote, worker state, end quote, introduces into it an indispensable correction. Far from, quote, demolishing, end quote, Trotskyism, it eliminates from Trotskyism a distorting element of contradiction and restores Trotskyism's essential harmony and continuity, end quote. Every word here is false. The truth is that Trotsky devoted the main energies of the late period of his life to analyzing the various stages of the development of the Soviet Union. His study of the degeneration of the Stalin regime ranks among his greatest theoretical contributions to Marxist thought. Even a conscientious opponent will admit that it is an integral part of Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution and of the Trotskyist program. Trotsky affirmed and reaffirmed this literally in scores of articles and books. Thus, in the programmatic document, the Soviet Union and the Fourth International, it is flatly stated, quote, the condition for further success is the correct evaluation of the world situation, including the class character of the Soviet Union. Along this line, the new (Fourth) and (International) will be subjected to test from the very first days of its existence, end quote. Leon Trotsky properly attached crucial importance to the class nature of the Soviet Union. It is only necessary to recall that the entire struggle against the Burnham-Shachtman faction, as well as their break with the Trotskyist movement, revolved in the main around the question of the USSR. Answering at that time the attempts of Burnham, supported by Shachtman, to smuggle into the program of the Fourth International the anti-Marxist notion that the regime of Stalinism represented the rule of a new exploiting class. Trotsky wrote that, quote, the perspective of a non-worker and a non-bourgeois society of exploitation or, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, is the perspective of complete defeat and the decline of the international proletariat, the perspective of the most profound historical pessimism, end quote. Leon Trotsky, In Defense of Marxism. The revisionist theory that a new social formation can come to replace capitalism concerns not only the USSR. Trotsky made this quite clear. Trotsky wrote, quote, it concerns the whole fate of the world proletariat and mankind, end quote. And Trotsky asked, quote, have we the slightest right to induce ourselves by purely terminological experiments in a new historic conception which occurs to be in an absolute contradiction with our program, strategy, and tactics, end quote. Trotsky. Burnham's theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, parenthesis, borrowed from Bruno, bracket, Rizzi, see glossary, end bracket, is now coolly offered as a, quote, indispensable correction, end quote, to Trotskyism. Shachtman tries to palm off as restoration of the, quote, essential harmony and continuity of Trotskyism, end quote, was flung back in Shachtman's face by Trotsky himself as an absolute contradiction of, quote, our program, strategy, and tactics, end quote. Or if you prefer, the whole, quote, the, quote, whole of Trotskyism, end quote. Small wonder that in 1940 Trotsky characterized Shachtman and Shachtman's tendency as that of, quote, ideological charlatanism, end quote. Petty, quote, petty bourgeois counterfeits of Marxism, end quote. Quote, outright theoretical betrayal, end quote. Let us review briefly the ABC of Marxism. Marxists view classes as the product of historical development. In other words, all classes have a past and a future as well as the present. Shachtman's, quote, new exploitative class, end quote, is, in Shachtman's own words, quote, without a past and without a future, end quote. Parenthesis, Shachtman, the struggle for the new course, end parenthesis. Lenin insisted that the roots of all class rule are to be found in the productive foundations of society. Lenin said, quote, the rule of the class is determined only by the relationship to property, end quote. To explain the rule of his, quote, new class, end quote, Shachtman points not to the foundation but to the political superstructure. It thus turns out that Shachtman's, quote, indispensable correction, end quote, applies not only to Trotsky but to Lenin and Marx as well. But Shachtman simply forgets to mention such trifles. Quote, wherein does the rule of the class, parenthesis, the proletariat, end parenthesis, express itself, end quote, asked Lenin. And he answered, quote, the rule of the proletariat expresses itself in the abolition of landed and capitalist property, end quote. Not the introduction of nationalized property and planning, but the abolition of the old property forms suffice for Lenin. How does Shachtman get around this? Very simply, Shachtman denies that his new class needs either to abolish previous property forms or institute new property forms of its own. Shachtman's class that has no past and no future possesses for its, quote, fundament, end quote, not property relations, but the, quote, ownership, end quote, of, quote, political power, end quote. Needless to say, this, quote, ownership, end quote, in its turn has neither a past nor a future. Such tripe is, according to Shachtman, quote, the various commonplace of Marxism, end quote. According to Marxists, the historical justification for every ruling class is the ability, under that ruling class's particular system of exploitation, to raise the development of productive sources of society as a whole to a new level. Does Shachtman grant this ability to Stalinism, i.e. his own, quote, new exploitative class, end quote? What then remains of the Marxist concept of class? The gist of Shachtman's 128-page argument boils down to the representation of the crimes of Stalinism as the birth pangs that mark the rise of a new class power. No more, no less. It is an elementary principle of Marxism that ruling classes rise in society through the operation of forces beyond the control of men's consciousness, reason, or will. The rise of a new ruling class can be retarded or facilitated but never prevented, until and unless these classes have exhausted their historic mission. In the light of this, what is Shachtman's version of the evolution of the Soviet Union, if not an attempt to supply a historical justification not for the ascendancy of a new class, but actually for the abominations of the Kremlin? It is not for nothing that Trotsky told Shachtman in 1940 that an attempt to revise the principal position of the Fourth International and the class nature of the USSR was a mockery of Marxism. In fact, according to Trotsky, to say that the Stalinist bureaucracy was a new exploitative class is to declare that the class struggle for socialism was only a utopian dream. Here's what Trotsky wrote, quote, "The historic alternative carried to the end is as follows. Either the Stalin regime is an abhorrent relapse in the process of transforming bourgeois society into socialist society, or the Stalin regime is the first stage of a new exploiting society. If the second prognosis proves correct, then of course the bureaucracy will become a new exploiting class. However onerous the second perspective may be, nothing else would remain except only to recognize that the socialist program, based on the internal contradictions of capitalist society, ends as a utopia," end quote. Shachtman's choice of the 1923 writings of Trotsky as the springboard for his polemic against Trotsky's position on the USSR is deliberate. The very date of the writing of these essays and the circumstances surrounding their publication precludes the possibility of their containing a fundamental analysis of the Stalinist degeneration in the Soviet Union. In 1923, Thermidor was still in the year of its birth. Lenin was still alive. The fate of the German Revolution still hung in the balance. Moreover, the major political differences between the Stalinist and the left opposition had not yet ripened. Stalin had not yet promulgated the theory of socialism in one country, which was to form the crux of the epic struggle. The events of the Chinese Revolution of 1925-27 and the Anglo-Russian Committee were still in the future. It is no slur upon the value of Trotsky's 1923 writings to say that they do not contain a finished analysis of events which had not yet occurred at the time. Shachtman, however, finds the new course indispensable for Shachtman's purposes, not for what the new course does say, but primarily for what the new course does not and could not of necessity say. Could Shachtman have published The Revolution Betrayed and attempted to refute the Revolution Betrayed? Or perhaps The Soviet Union and the Fourth International, the peace, and attempted to refute that? Shachtman might at least have attempted to review In Defense of Marxism, which contains the most finished and most recent analysis of the Soviet Union made by Trotsky, and is in addition addressed in person to Shachtman and co. Shachtman's perspicacity, lamentably limited though it may be, extends at least far enough for him to foresee the consequences of such foolhardy enterprises. Discretion is indeed the better part of valor for Shachtman. The Trotskyist movement holds that the Soviet Union remains a degenerated worker state, basing that analysis upon the property forms of the Soviet Union, the existence of nationalized property and monopoly of foreign trade. This position is a line of demarcation between Trotskyism and all hostile and alien tendencies in the labor movement. In order to give a picture of the Soviet Union to advanced workers, Trotskyists have often drawn an analogy between the first worker state and a trade union. Just as trade unions have become corrupted and degenerated, losing trade unions' internal democracy and giving up militant struggle in defense of the interest of the membership, just so the Soviet Union, subject to far more enormous pressures, has been altered. But the degenerated worker state and the degenerated trade union remain class organizations, and a struggle must be conducted to reform them and to defend them against the capitalists. Shachtman discusses the trade unions analogy only to abandon this time the Marxist position on trade unions. We quote Shachtman verbatim, quote, "The trade unions remain trade unions, no matter how bureaucratized they become, so long as they fight, ineptly or skillfully, reformistically or militantly, in the defense of the workers' share of the national income, or at least against the workers' share's diminution. Once trade unions give up that fight, they may call themselves what they will. They may have ever so many workers in their ranks, as many company unions have, but they are no longer class organizations. John L. Lewis's, U.S. mine workers leader, organization is still a trade union. Robert Lay's, leader of Hitler's, quote, Labor Front, is not, The point of view is clear. It is consistent, it is harmonious with the Shachtmanite point of view on the Soviet Union. It likewise happens to be the traditional position of the ultra-leftists. Lenin polemicized against it in the infantile disease of left-wing communism, the peace, or left-wing communism, infantile disorder. It is precisely on this theory that the Stalinist constructed their thesis of, quote, social fascism, end quote, and their designation of the AFL as a, quote, fascist, end quote, organization. Quote, the trade unions remain trade unions no matter how bureaucratized the trade unions become, so long as the trade unions fight, parenthesis, ineptly or skillfully, reformistically or militantly, end parenthesis, in the defense of the workers' share of the national income, or at least against the workers' share of the national income's diminution, end quote. But what of those unions that have abandoned the fight? What of those bureaucratized leaderships which have offered their cooperation to the war administration and fight for the diminution of the workers' share of the national income? What of the Stalinist-controlled unions? Shachtman's answer is clear. Quote, they are no longer class organizations, end quote. By this criterion, the trade union movement of the United States, parenthesis, and not only the United States, end parenthesis, have all but disappeared. Notice the examples given. Quote, John L. Lewis's organization is still a trade union. Robert Lay's is not, end quote. A typical Shachtmanite evasion. In order to find an example of a union that is, quote, still a union, end quote, Shachtman cites the one union which has conducted 4 general coal strikes in the midst of the war. Shachtman is willing to admit it is still a union. This generous fellow would give ice away at the North Pole. Somebody should inform him that any schoolchild would readily agree that the United Mine Workers is, quote, still, end quote, a union, while the Nazi Labor Front is not. But the question remains, what is the Hod Carriers Union, which holds conventions every 99 years, or the Stalinist-run UE, which fights for incentive pay, not against it, or any one of a dozen others? When a union is involved in a strike against the bosses, all labor must rally to the defense, even though a bureaucracy dominates the particular union. People who advocate defeatism or the striking union are traitors to the labor movement. That is the role of Shachtman, who denies defense to the Soviet Union in its struggle against Nazi imperialism. Among the primary results of the Nazi-Soviet war has been the elucidation of the attitude of the Soviet masses toward the state which emerged from the October Revolution. Of the attitude of the Soviet workers and peasants to the Stalinist bureaucracy, there can be no doubt. Stalin has betrayed their democratic hopes by making a prison house of the Soviet Union. Stalin has betrayed their revolutionary aspirations by his continual abasement before world imperialism. The hatred of the masses for the Stalinist caste, so long expressed through the struggle of the advanced workers under the banner of the Trotskyist left opposition, will break out into the open at the first decisive turn in the European situation. But what of the attitude of the masses towards the Soviet state? The remarkable spirit of fighting energy, not only of the Red Army, but of the whole people, demonstrate their conviction that something important remains in the Soviet Union which must be defended, something which they feel belongs to them. The morale of the Red Army is the envy of the purifying bourgeois military staffs everywhere. None of them can duplicate it because its secret lies in that event which they all hate so thoroughly, the October Revolution of 1917. Shachtman attempts to dismiss the morale of the Soviet peoples as of little significance. In 1940, during the Soviet-Finnish War, Shachtman was concerned about it. At that time, the Soviet workers, repelled by Stalin's counter-revolutionary policy, by the spectacle of the leadership and collaboration between Stalin and Hitler, and more important, not yet actually feeling the pressure of the bourgeois military intervention against the first worker state, prosecuted the war with indifference. At that time, Shachtman, like any shyster lawyer, Jesus Christ, considered, was this fucking Frank Reynolds? At that time, Shachtman, like any shyster lawyer, considered testimony related to the morale of the Red Army to be perfectly admissible evidence as to the, quote, character of the war, end quote. End quote. He and his followers quoted derisively Trotsky's prediction as to the morale of the Soviet people in the event of war. That forecast is well worth repeating now. Quote, within the USSR, war against imperialist intervention will undoubtedly provoke a veritable outburst of genuine feeling of enthusiasm. all the contradictions and antagonisms will seem overcome, at any rate relegated to the background. The young generation of workers and peasants that emerged from the revolution will reveal on the field of battle a colossal dynamic power. Centralized industry, despite all centralized industries' lacks and shortcomings, will reveal great superiority in serving war needs. The government of the USSR has undoubtedly created great stores of food supplies sufficient for the first period of war. The general staffs of the imperialist states clearly realize, of course, that in the Red Army they will meet a powerful adversary, the struggle with whom will require long intervals of time and a terrific straining of forces." End quote. These are the words at which Shachtman scoffed during the Finnish events. "Where is the, quote, genuine fighting enthusiasm," end quote, he then taunted. "Have you seen that spirit yet? The Soviet masses have given their answer." During the factional struggle in the Socialist Workers' Party in 1939 to 1940, Shachtman's petty bourgeois opposition insisted that its sole political point of difference with the majority of the party was over the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. The class nature of the Soviet Union, they explained, was no concern of theirs, quote, "at the moment," end quote, and was only dragged into the dispute by Trotsky for, quote, "factional demagogic purposes," end quote. Quote, "Is it not demagoguery for Trotsky to direct polemics against Eastman and Hooke or Bruno instead of against our ideas," end quote, claimed Burnham and Shachtman. Today, Burnham writes from the standpoint of an avowed enemy of Marxism, while Shachtman espouses the former position of Burnham, who in turn borrowed it from Bruno. Today, Shachtman even deduces as his main, quote, "proof," end quote, of the existence of a new class the argument adduced originally by Bruno, namely Stalin's purges and frame-up trials of 1936 to 38. A modest disciple never fails gratefully to acknowledge his teacher. Shachtman ungraciously ignores his true precipitors, Burnham and Bruno. Equipped with the compass of Marxism, Trotsky charted in the struggle of 1939 to 40 not only our own course, but the future course of the Shachtmanites. That is why Trotsky was able to write an annihilating answer to Shachtman's, quote, "theoretical," unquote, document long before Shachtman set it down on paper. Trotsky's writings in defense of Marxism require no, quote, "corrections," end quote. Trotsky's characterization of Shachtman as a, quote, "charlatan" and a, quote, "betrayer" are as true today as when Trotsky wrote them in 1940. Again, that piece was titled "Property Forms Define the Workers' State" by Harry Braverman, 1944. Originally published in Fourth International, May 1944. The next piece is titled "Stalinist State Property Defines a New Exploitative Class Society." This is by Max Shachtman, and it's from 1944. Let's see if there's an original title. It was originally published, I guess this is the original title. It was originally published in New International, August 1944 and October 1944. Leon Trotsky's name will be forever linked with the Russian Revolution, not of course as a Russian Revolution, but as the beginning of the International Socialist Revolution in Russia. Leon Trotsky fought for his revolution with pen and sword from his study and from his armored train in the Red Army. Between the start of his fight under Tsarism and its end under Stalinism, there is a continuous line, the line flowing from Trotsky's great contribution to Marxism, the theory of the permanent revolution. Except for the first period of the Bolshevik Revolution, when the theory was not and could not be attacked, it might be said that all of Trotsky's literary political activity revolved around the elaboration of his theory and its defense from critics. Which critics? The guide in choosing the objects of his polemics was not always their prominence or importance, the extent of the front along which they attacked Trotsky's views, the weightiness of their criticism. Wherever Trotsky was given an opportunity to elucidate his views, to expand upon them from a new angle, to fortify them in a new way, he seized upon it. The critic did not need to be Stalin or Radek, even if he was so obscure, and his criticism so trivial or absurd, that the mere mention of his name by Trotsky sufficed to save him from oblivion. Trotsky did not for that reason disdain to deal with him. Ample evidence of this is to be found throughout Trotsky's writings. The evidence relates not only to polemics about his theory of the permanent revolution, but more generally to any of the important views Trotsky held. Similarly, with those who were his students and his followers in every country. One example is the New International, which month in and month out from its first issue onward emulated Trotsky by its systematic defense of the principles and program of Marxism against all critics, honest or mendacious, big or small, partial or total. It is, after all, only by this method that the Marxian movement can maintain theoretical alertness, preserve its preeminence over all other currents in the working class, and imbue its followers with informed confidence, in contrast to the blind faith, nurtured ignorance or confusion, and slick demagogy that holds together other movements. What is said above applies not only to debate of Marxists with non- or anti-Marxists, but to discussions within the Marxist movement itself. There we have too often heard that a discussion is a, quote, luxury, end quote. It is as much a luxury to the movement as the circulation of blood is a luxury to the human body. In the 1939-40 discussion in the Socialist Workers' Party, Trotsky repeatedly challenged the then opposition, now the Workers' Party, to debate first and foremost the question of the class character of the Soviet Union. He taking, as is well known, the standpoint of that Russia is a degenerated worker state. It goes without saying that he did not for a moment consider it a, quote, closed question, end quote, precluding all discussion, although it is no less true that on this question his own position was firm and aggressive. For questions that were then, and often since, advanced, the opposition did not wish to debate on this ground. If the writer may speak personally for a moment, I not only did not wish to debate the view that Russia was still a worker state, but I could not if I would. Like so many other members of the opposition, and not a few of the majority, I developed some doubts, as an otherwise dull commentator correctly observed, on the correctness of our traditional position, without being able to say to myself, and therefore to others, that this position was fundamentally false, and that an alternative position had to replace it, inasmuch as only a dilettante, but not a serious politician, can be, quote, skeptical toward all theories, end quote, or engage in a dispute on the basis of, quote, doubts. Let me make them a polemical platform. Let me alone make them a polemical platform. It was manifestly impossible for me, and not me alone, to take up Trotsky's challenge. Doubts are a bridge you cannot stand on for long. Either you go back to the old views or move on to new views. Along with several other comrades who sought to probe the question seriously, thoroughly, and in an unclouded atmosphere, I helped work out in 1940-41 a critique of Trotsky's theory of Russia as a degenerated worker state. We arrived at an analysis and conclusions of our own, summed up in the phrase, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. A new class, exploitative state in Russia, which is neither bourgeois nor proletarian, but is basically different from any other class regime preceding or contemporary with it, we proceeded to set forth our views in dozens of articles in our press. Stalin's assassin deprived Trotsky of the opportunity, which he would undoubtedly have taken, to subject these views to criticism. But the, quote, official, end quote, Trotskyist press, the militant in the Fourth International, for 3 years it maintained complete silence. It did not, you see, deign to reply, unless a reply means repeating that we are, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, counter-revolutionists, end quote, enemies of the Soviet Union, quote, renegades from Marxism, common thieves, end quote, and the like, quote, arguments, which had failed to convince us when they originally appeared in the Daily Worker. Yet not only we, but all those interested in Trotsky's views, especially those who supported them, had a right to expect an objective reply to our point of view from the Socialist Workers' Party spokesman. Our theory is the first serious attempt to present a rounded analysis of the Stalinist state from the Marxian standpoint, which, while basing itself in many respects on the invaluable contributions of Trotsky, is at the same time a criticism of Trotsky's conclusions. Our theory, that furthermore, is a unique contribution to the question and not a rehash of old, refuted, discredited doctrines. We do not contend that it cannot be successfully disputed, only that it has not been. The Socialist Workers' Party did not even make an attempt to dispute it. When we finally published the first English edition of Trotsky's classic, written in 1923, The New Course, and added to it, as is our custom, an essay by the editor, it explained to the new reader the historical circumstances of the work, the work's significance in the light of subsequent events, plus a critical re-examination of Trotsky's later theory of the, quote, workers' state, end quote. We felt that the Socialist Workers' Party would now have to reply. Some of us thought it would assign a responsible, theoretically and politically equipped spokesman to review the book as it deserves to be reviewed. Others thought that at most it would assign the job to some unschooled lad equipped with an advanced case of psittacosis and a penchant for abuse. Obviously, some of us were wrong. Under the characteristically restrained title, quote, A Defamer of Marxism, end quote, a review of the book appeared at last in the May 1944 issue of the Fourth International over the signature of Harry Frankel. And again, that's Harry Braverman. This is, as we shall see, the literal equivalent of saying, since the soup is too hot to handle, we might as well spit in it. Frankel wasted only a few indifferent words on the section of the book written by Trotsky. Frankel concedes, it is true, that the new course is, quote, beef, whereas, quote, Shachtman's essay is the antipod, it is tripe, end quote. But Braverman leaves the impression in the few sentences Braverman devotes to the new course that it is merely an initial, immature, and dated effort by Trotsky. This is in the order of things. Trotsky's The New Course is even more timely today than when it was first written. It is one of his most durable works. It is a classic socialist statement on workers' democracy. It is perhaps the clearest exposition ever written of what democracy means in a centralized revolutionary proletarian party. It is, of course, a specific analysis of the problem of a specific party after it has taken power in a specific country and under specific conditions. This is not to detract from its general applicability. What Trotsky says there about party democracy, about a free and vibrant internal life, about the role of tradition and the need of constantly enriching it, about critical and independent party thought, about Leninism, about discussion and how they should be conducted, about loyalty in discussion and in leadership, about the relations between leaders and ranks, between, quote, young and, quote, old, about bureaucratism and conservatism, about factions and groupings, and a dozen other vital problems of any revolutionary party, amounts to an annihilating criticism of the inter-party regime of the Socialist Workers' Party today, of its leaders and their methods. Frankel's silence in all this is generally deprecatory remarks are in the order of things. Frankel Braverman again, sorry. I guess you already know that, but I don't want to confuse myself. Had Braverman spoken commendatorily and at length about the ideas Trotsky put forward in the new course, Braverman could only have brought a wry smile to the lips of every thinking member of the Socialist Workers' Party. Perhaps we do Braverman an injustice. Perhaps Braverman is so eager to work on the tripe that Braverman has no time for the beef. The tripe Braverman divides into 5 important parts. Braverman deals with the parentage of our theory, the question of our theory's significance in the, quote, whole of Trotskyism, end quote, the question of the roots of class rule, the question of the historical place of the Stalin bureaucracy, the question of the analogy between Russia and a trade union. If we pursue him through his often dreary and never bright abuse, it is because the task, though thankless, is not without profit. Frankel writes, today Burnham writes from the standpoint of an avowed enemy of Marxism. Quote, today Burnham writes from a standpoint of an avowed enemy of Marxism, while Shachtman espouses the former position of Burnham, who in turn borrowed that position from Bruno. Today Shachtman even adduces as his main, quote, proof, end quote, of the existence of a new class the argument adduced originally by Bruno, namely Stalin's purges and the frame-up trials of 1936-38. A modest disciple never fails gratefully to acknowledge his teacher. Shachtman ungraciously ignores his true preceptors, Bruno and Burnham, end quote. And elsewhere, quote, Burnham's theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, parenthesis, borrowed from Bruno, end parenthesis, is now coolly offered as a, quote, indispensable correction, end quote, to Trotskyism, end quote. About Burnham, our readers know something, and so presumably does Braverman. But who is this sinister Bruno? All we know of Bruno is that just before the war, Lai wrote a book. Just before the war, he wrote a book in France on the, quote, bureaucratization of the world, end quote. This book we never read. Neither did Braverman. The only thing Braverman knows about Bruno, about whose views Braverman speaks, and whose impressive familiarity, is the reference made to Bruno's work by Trotsky in 1939 in a few sentences. It takes a high grade of impertinence or transoceanic vision, one of which Braverman certainly possesses, to speak with such assuredness about views elaborated in a book you have neither seen nor read, and about which all you know is a dozen paraphrasing sentences written by a critic. But can't it be assumed that the sentences in which Trotsky sums up the views of one of the, quote, parents, end quote, of our theory are adequate? We are ready to do so. According to Trotsky's summary, Bruno seems to hold the theory that, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, or the bureaucratic state, is a new unprecedented exploitative social order with a new ruling class, which exists not only in Russia, but also in Germany, and in a less developed form in, quote, New Deal America, and is, in a word, sweeping the world. According to this theory, there is no class difference between the German-US type of state and the Russian type. As is known, Burnham's latest theory is similar, apparently, to Bruno's. What, however, is such a theory to do with ours? In every article we have written on the subject and the official resolution of our party, we have repeatedly emphasized the unique class character of the Russian state, its fundamental difference not only from a workers' state, but from all the bourgeois states, be they fascist or democratic. Time and again we have polemicized against the theory that Russia and Germany, for example, have the same class state or social system or ruling class, against those who, like Burnham and MacDonald, held that both countries were, quote, bureaucratic collectivists, end quote, as well as against those who held that both were capitalists. Our party has formally rejected both these standpoints. If our cavalier is aware of these facts, he is practicing a fraud on his readers by concealing them. If he is unaware of them, he is practicing a fraud on readers by dealing with matters he is ignorant of. Take your choice. In the new course, Trotsky lays the greatest stress on loyalty and discussion, on the importance of an honest presentation of your opponent's views, on the reprehensibility of amalgamating one view with views that are essentially alien to it. No wonder Frankel thinks so little of the book. Where does our theory have its roots? Primarily in the writings of Trotsky! More accurately, in the resolving of the two basic irreconcilable theories about Russia as a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, which are to be found in Trotsky's writings. For a long time, Trotsky rightly based his theory that Russia is a degenerated worker state on the view that, to one degree or another, in one form or another, the Soviet proletariat still retained political power, that it could yet submit its bureaucracy to its control, that it could regenerate the state by means of profound reform. Indeed, Trotsky repeated that the proof of the working-class character of the Soviet states lies in the fact that the regime could still be changed by reform. This theory Trotsky later abandoned, substituting the point of view that although the proletariat had lost all semblance of political power and control, and an uncontrolled counter-revolutionary bureaucracy had complete possession of the state power, and that it could not be removed save by means of violent revolution, the state was nevertheless proletarian by virtue of the existence of state property. Only Trotsky's immense authority in the movement made possible the acceptance of a theory which up to that time had never been held by any Marxist. In numerous articles, we have pointed out the contradiction between the two theories. We have pointed out how Trotsky abandoned the one for the other without so much as a link between them. We have showed how Trotsky was compelled to abandon his original theory because events refuted the essential predictions about Russia's evolution, which he based on it. The voluminous quotations we have adduced from Trotsky's writings are simple simply irrefutable. Enough of them are cited again in our essay on the new course. Franco does not even hint at their existence. Parenthesis, we are making the audacious assumption that Franco Braverman actually read the book, end parenthesis. With consummate native skill, Braverman plays dumb on this point, and not on this point alone. This is not all. Franco knows, and if he does not know, why does he venture to blacken so much innocent white paper? That our press, the present writer in particular, has called attention to the fact that the first man, parenthesis, so far as we know, end parenthesis, in the Trotskyist movement who put forward the theory that the Stalinist bureaucracy is a new ruling class based on a new, quote, property form, end quote, was neither Shachtman, Burnham, or God help us, the mysterious Bruno, but Christian Rakovsky. I have a piece about Christian Rakovsky on here, on this channel. More than a decade ago, Christian Rakovsky, next to Trotsky, the outstanding leader of the opposition, presents this view in a theoretical document of his own, which was circulated through the Russian opposition. Trotsky, although he obviously did not share this view, printed it in the organ of the Russian opposition without comment and certainly without denunciation. He was not made of the same stern and intransigent stuff as his eminent theoretical successor, Harry Braverman. There is enough guidance, moreover, in letters of oppositionist exiles and the testimony of Ante Siliga that Rakovsky's theory was shared by a considerable number of Russian Trotskyists. Poor devils! Exclamation point. They had no Franco to explain to them that they were, quote, defamers of Marxism, end quote, purveyors of tripe, and belonged, as he so delicately puts it, to the, quote, legion of emasculators, vulgarizers, and falsifiers, end quote, of Trotskyism. We do not hesitate for a moment to say that this or that element of our theory as a whole is taken from numerous other sources, including, if you please, Burnham, parenthesis, the Burnham of 1937 to 38, of course, and not the Burnham of 1940 or today, end parenthesis. If our critics derive satisfaction from this readily made acknowledgement, it is either because they do not know anything but the, quote, they do not know anything about the, quote, alien, end quote, origins and components of the entire theoretical system of Marxism, or because they do not care. For the construction of our theory, for its synthesis, for the ideas of others and of our own incorporated into it, for the manner in which they are incorporated and interlinked, we and we alone are responsible. Quote, with typical impudence, end quote, says Harry Braverman, to whom impudence of any kind is as foreign as a bad odor to a sty, quote, Shachtman pretends that Trotsky's class analysis of the Soviet Union as a degenerated workers' state, quote, is not even a decisively important part, end quote, of Trotskyism. This is like saying that a man could function without a heart, end quote. We thus learn for the first time, but from an authority, that the, quote, heart, end quote, of Trotskyism is the theory of the, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, which of the two theories Trotsky held on this subject is the, quote, heart, end quote, of Trotskyism. The author does not say. After all, what does it mean? After all, what does it matter? In our own confused way, we have always, though with the, in our own confused way, we have always thought that the, quote, heart of Trotskyism is the theory of the permanent revolution and the struggle for it. Franco, we regretfully accord, has not changed our opinion. For if the theory that Stalinist Russia is still a degenerated worker state is the, quote, heart, end quote, of Trotskyism, then obviously Trotskyism was without a heart, and consequently non-existent, before the Russian Revolution and during the early years of the Revolution. It seems equally obvious that if Russia should tomorrow cease to be a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, either by virtue of its regeneration or its transformation into a capitalist state, the, quote, heart, end quote, of Trotskyism would thereby be removed, leaving only a lifeless carcass which Braverman would not consider worthy of decent burial. To put it differently, the restoration of the Russian Revolution to full life would produce the instantaneous death of Trotskyism. Or, to strain fairness towards an inimitable dialectician to the groaning point, if the, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, were replaced by a revolutionary workers' state, Trotskyism would have a new, quote, heart, end quote, grafted onto Trotskyism, Trotskyism's old heart being removed to a bottle of formaldehyde labeled, quote, this was the heart of Trotskyism when Russia was a degenerated workers' state, removed only in the case of similar contingency. Dr. Frankel, or Dr. Braverman, MD, end quote. Yeah, Shachtman's funny. Only one other thing need be said about this nightmarish idiocy. We consider ourselves Trotskyists because we are partisans of the theory of the permanent revolution, because Trotskyism incarnated the tradition and principles of revolutionary Marxism, of socialist internationalism, above all, in a period when these principles were being trampled under every foot. We are not idolaters, precisely because we are Trotskyists. We know how easy it is, as Lenin used to say sardonically, to, quote, swear by God, end quote, and we have only pitying contempt for those who substitute the quotations for the living idea, worship parrotry for critical thought. We are Trotskyists, but we do not, quote, swear by God, end quote. But if it can be truly demonstrated that the very, quote, heart, end quote, of Trotskyism is the belief that Russia today is a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, and that all the other organs and limbs of Trotskyism live from the bloom pumped to them by this heart, then the present writer at least would promptly cease calling himself a Trotskyist. At the same time, however, he would have to conclude that Trotskyism and Marxism are not reconcilable. Fortunately, no such conclusion is indicated or necessary or possible. We come now to the third of Braverman's 5 points. Here we must admonish the reader. He must resolve in advance not to laugh himself sick. On this he must be firm, for Braverman offers more temptations than the unforewarned reader can possibly resist. The reader is surely acquainted with the point. An analogy is made between the bureaucratized trade unions with their bourgeois-minded leaders and bureaucratized Russia, quote, just as trade unions have become corrupted and degenerated, losing their internal democracy and giving up militant struggle in defense of the interests of the membership, just so the Soviet Union, subject to far more enormous pressures, has been altered, end quote, writes Frankel, Braverman. But the degenerated workers' state and the degenerated trade union remain class organizations, and a struggle must be conducted to reform, exclamation point, end parenthesis, the degenerated worker state and the degenerated trade union, and to defend the degenerated worker state and the degenerated trade union against the capitalists, end quote. Parenthesis, according to Trotsky, the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, cannot be reformed according to the heart specialist. It must be reformed. Braverman does not know the difference between revolution and reform, but in every other respect, Braverman is an authority on Trotskyism and, above all, on what lies at Trotskyism's heart, end parenthesis. The, quote, trade union analogy, end quote, has long been a favorite argument of the defenders of the theory that Russia is a degenerated worker state. Following Trotsky, the present writer used the, quote, analogy, end quote, more than once. Along with others, he accepted it uncritically from Trotsky. This acceptance was eased, so to speak, by the fact that the analogy is a long and worthy standing dating back to the earliest days of the Russian Revolution. But if it is traced back clearly to those days, it will be seen that the analogy was entirely legitimate in its time. It was not employed to prove that Russia was a worker state, however. It was employed to show why the worker state did not always operate as the ideal program indicated. Between the two uses of the analogy, there is a world of difference. Whatever may have been our errors on this point in the past, they look like downright virtues in comparison with what Braverman does with it. We beg the reader to follow very closely. It would be a pity to miss any part of it. Quote, Shachtman discusses the trade union analogy only to abandon this time the Marxist position on trade unions, end quote, says our relentless Spartan. Shachtman, it is clear, has left very little of Marxism, and Frankel has left very little of Shachtman. But even if there were less, it would still suffice for what follows. Wherein lies this new, quote, abandonment, end quote? Read carefully the quotation from Shachtman which Braverman cites, quote, The trade unions are made trade unions no matter how bureaucratized those trade unions become, as long as those trade unions fight, ineptly or skillfully, reformistically or militantly, in the defense of the workers' share of the national income, or at least against its diminution. Once they give up that fight, they may call themselves what they will. They may have ever so many workers in their ranks, as many company unions have, but they are no longer class organizations. John L. Lewis's organization is still a trade union. Robert Lay's is not. End quote. Now read just as carefully Frankel's comment on this definition, part of which we ourselves emphasize. Quote, "This point of view is clear. It is consistent, it is harmonious with the Shachtmanite point of view on the Soviet Union. It likewise happens to be the traditional position of the ultra-leftist. Lenin polemicized against it in the infantile disease of left-wing communism. It is precisely on this theory that the Stalinists constructed their thesis of, quote, social fascism, end quote, and their designation of the AFL as a, quote, fascist, end quote, organization. What's right is right. Our view on the trade unions is clear, consistent and harmonious with our views on Russia. Everything else in this quotation, except for the spelling and punctuation, is, if we may be given the obvious abusiveness provoked by snarling, stubborn ignorance, wrong and stupid. Frankel thinks I cited the Lewis Union because it is, quote, the one union that has conducted 4 general coal strikes in the midst of the war, ... The generous fellow would give ice away at the North Pole, end quote. A heart specialist, a trade union expert, and a wit to boot. The fact is, the United Mine Workers was cited by me not because it, quote, conducted 4 general coal strikes in the midst of the war, end quote, but because the United Mine Workers is one of the most bureaucratically constructed, managed, and controlled unions in the country, and yet is a proletarian organization. Our wit is persistent, quote, but the question remains, what is the Hod Carriers Union, which holds conventions every 99 years, or the Stalinist-run UE, which fights for incentive pay, not against it, or any one of a dozen others, end quote. The answer to these questions must be given, we fear. Braverman is old enough to be told the truth, at least in a whisper. The members of the Hod Carriers Union are among the highest paid workers in the United States. The union leaders are despots, some are even said to be gangsters, grafters, and corruptionists. Some have made a mighty good thing for themselves out of unionism, but by terroristic methods, if you will, by bureaucratic and reactionary methods, and with the aim of feathering their own nests. They work and must work, quote, in the defense of the workers' share of the national income, or at least against the workers' share of the national income's diminution, end quote. If they did not, the union would disappear, and so would the very basis on which their autocratic power and privilege are built up. The Stalinist-led unions are, of course, somewhat different, but fundamentally the same. Take even incentive pay. The Stalinists put it forward, and are compelled to put it forward as a means of increasing the workers' income. We say that the incentive pay system, while it would increase the income of some workers, or of all of them temporarily, would do so at the expense of the muscles and nerves of the workers, at the expense of their long-range interests, at the expense of the solidarity and fighting power of the union, etc., etc. How mortifying the thought that the ABCs have to be explained to a Marxian theoretician of such height, breadth, and weight. 4 times we read Braverman's comment on our definition, but nowhere did we find a word to indicate how he defines a trade union, how he would distinguish even the most reactionary trade union from a company union, or from Robert Lay's, quote, labor front. What standard would he employ? That it was originally formed by workers, that it is composed of workers, that it claims to speak for workers? What? If instead of comparing Russia with a union, we would compare a union with Russia, then by Frankel's standards a union would still deserve the name. If the, quote, union, end quote, bureaucracy had all the power, if it had an army and police at its disposal to oppress the members, if it could be removed from office only by violent insurrection, if it ran prisons for recalcitrant members, if it made an alliance with U.S. Steel for joint picket lines against Republic Steel, if we opposed the organization of the unorganized, quote, against the seizure of new territories by the Kremlin, end quote, Trotsky, end parenthesis. If we favored the withdrawal, say, of its Negro members to form a separate union, parenthesis, quote, independence of the Ukraine, end quote, Trotsky, end parenthesis, and so forth, Lay's, quote, union, end quote, could easily fit such a definition. Disappointed by Frankel's failure to define a union, we seek elsewhere. Perhaps the following definition will prove acceptable. The character of such a workers' organization as that of a trade union is determined by its relation to the distribution of the national income. The fact that Green and Co. defend private property in the means of production characterizes them as bourgeois. Should these gentlemen in addition defend the income of the bourgeoisie from the attacks on the part of the workers? Should they conduct a struggle against strikes, against the raising of wages, against help to the unemployed, then we would have an organization of scabs and not a trade union. However, Green and Co., in order not to lose their base, must lead within certain limits the struggle of the workers for an increase, or at least against diminution of their share in the national income. The objective symptom is sufficient in all important cases to permit us to draw a line of demarcation between the most reactionary trade union and an organization of scabs. Thus we are duty-bound not only to carry on work in the AFL, but to defend the AFL from scabs, the KKK, and the like. Was that a quote? It doesn't say if it's a quote or not. Maybe that was... I don't know if that was Shachtman or if that was Trotsky. I feel like I've read that line before, but I can't be sure. Is this the, quote, traditional position of the ultra-leftists, end quote? Is this what Lenin polemicized against? Is this, quote, precisely, end quote, the theory on which the, quote, Stalinists constructed their thesis on, quote, social fascism, end quote? Is this clear? Is it consistent? Is it too, quote, harmonious with Shachtman's point of view on the Soviet Union, end quote? Doesn't every one of Frankel's strictures against Shachtman's definition apply equally to this definition? Absolutely. No more, no less. Who is the author of this second definition? Shachtman? No. Shachtman is guilty only of having copied it, in some places word for word, in all places meaning for meaning. It is Trotsky who is guilty of writing it. Our quote, authority, end quote, will find it in the December 1937 internal bulletin of the Socialist Workers' Party, number 3, page 4. Trotsky says you recognize the difference between a scab outfit and a union by the fact that the union, even under Green and Co., quote, must lead within certain limits the struggle of the workers for an increase or at least against diminution of their share in the national income, end quote. Shachtman, frankly, quote, plagiarizing, end quote, from Trotsky, says you recognize the difference between a fascist, quote, front, end quote, and a union by the fact that the union, even under Lewis and Co., quote, fight, parenthesis, ineptly or skillfully, reformistically or militantly, end parenthesis, in the defense of the workers' share of the national income or at least against its diminution, end quote. The thought and even the language are identical and not by accident, for both are dealing. Mr. Authority with the ABCs of Marxism both are dealing, Mr. Trade Union Expert with the ABCs of trade unionism. And what does the expert authority say about these definitions? Not the stupid things about Lenin and social fascism, but the unwitting, intelligent things. He says, let us remember, that, quote, this point of view is harmonious with the Shachtonite point of view on the Soviet Union, end quote. Agreed. No complaint. We could complain, however, if we were given to indignation over such things. If we were, then we might say, have we really committed such unforgivable crimes that in a discussion of this importance you send against us a zero who does not know what the, quote, heart, end quote, of Trotskyism is, where the roots of our theory lie, what the difference is between revolution and reform in Russia, or even what a common ordinary trade union is, not even what Trotsky said it is, and who argues that Trotsky's definition of a union is harmonious with Shachtman's definition of Russia. Inasmuch as indignation is really not called for here, pity is the more appropriate emotion. We do not make this complaint. It seems to us, however, that the membership of the Socialist Workers' Party does have grounds for energetic complaint. Does our party have to discredit itself so ridiculously? Is this the only way we have of replying to the views of the Workers' Party? These questions will gain greater poignancy when we examine the last 2 points dealt with by the authority. We fear he will not fare too well under the examination. We invited honest, sober, and informed criticism of our position. Instead, we got Braverman. The fault is clearly not ours. We have already seen that our critic does not know what the, quote, heart of Trotskyism, end quote, is. What are the sources of our criticism of Trotsky's theory of the, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, and that he does not even know what a trade union is. We have also established that by Frankel's involuntary admission, Trotsky's conception of a trade union, which Frankel attributes to Shachtman alone, quote, is clear. It is consistent, it is harmonious with the Shachtmanite point of view on the Soviet Union, end quote. There remain 2 of the original 5 points to deal with, the question of the roots of class rule and the question of the historical place of the Stalin bureaucracy. Marxists view classes as the product of historical development. In other words, all classes have a past and a future, as well as the present. Shachtman's, quote, new exploitative... Is this a quote? I'm not sure. Where is it? Yeah, I think this is a quote. Quote, Marxists view classes as the product of historical development. In other words, all classes have a past and a future, as well as the present. Shachtman's, quote, new exploitative class, end quote, is, in Shachtman's own words, quote, without a past and without a future, end quote. Parenthesis, Max Shachtman, The Struggle for the New Course, end parenthesis. Lenin insisted that the roots of all class rule are to be found in the productive foundations of society. Lenin said, quote, the rule of the class is determined only by the relationship to property, end quote. To explain the rule of his, quote, new class, end quote, Shachtman points not to the foundation but to the political superstructure. It turns out that Shachtman's, quote, indispensable correction, end quote, applies not only to Trotsky but to Lenin and Marx as well. But Shachtman simply forgets to mention such trifles. Quote, wherein does the rule of the class, bracket, the proletariat, end bracket, express itself, end quote, asked Lenin. And he answered, quote, the rule of the proletariat expresses itself in the abolition of landed and capitalist property, end quote. Not the introduction of nationalized property and planning, but the abolition of old property forms sufficed for Lenin. How does Shachtman get around this? Very simply, Shachtman denies that his new class needs either to abolish previous property forms or institute new ones of its own. He denies that his new class needs either to abolish previous property forms or institute new ones of its own. Shachtman's class, that has no past and no future, possesses for its, quote, fundament, end quote, not property relations, but the, quote, ownership, end quote, of, quote, political power, end quote. Needless to say, this, quote, ownership, end quote, in its turn has neither a past nor a future. Such tripe is, according to Shachtman, quote, the various commonplace of Marxism, end quote. Parenthesis, Fourth International, May 1944, end parenthesis. I guess to say, end quote, Fourth International, end quote, Fourth International, May 1944. This is typical Braverman. Ex parts ignorance, parenthesis, principal ingredient, end parenthesis, ex parts falsification, parenthesis, never omitted, end parenthesis, ex parts insolence, parenthesis, the style is the man, end parenthesis, and ex parts plain, ordinary, anhydrous muddle-headedness. The solvent is not even tap water. This chemical analysis requires demonstration. Here it is. 1. For Lenin, the roots of class rule are to be found in the productive foundations of society. Shachtman, however, who simply forgets to mention, parenthesis, note, quote, forgets to mention, end quote, end parenthesis, such trifles, points not to the foundation but to the political superstructure. That Shachtman, who in his way as human as Braverman may forget to mention one trifle or another is more than possible, but the trifle of which Braverman speaks, with the mastery of sarcasm which marks Braverman out from a world of dullards, was not forgotten by Shachtman. Not only was it not forgotten, but it is to this very trifle that the origin of the new ruling class in Russia was traced. In the struggle for the new course, it says, quote, "At bottom, classes have risen and come to power through history in response to the developing needs of production which preceding classes were unable to satisfy. This is the case also with the new ruling class in Russia. The Russian bourgeoisie had ample opportunity to prove that the Russian bourgeoisie could not or could no longer develop the productive forces of the country. It came upon the scene too late to play the historically progressive role it played in Western countries. ... But if the bourgeoisie came too late, the proletariat of Russia came to power, so to speak, quote, too early, end quote. It is, of course, more proper to say that the rest of the European proletariat did not come to power early enough. The result of this retardation of the world revolution are known. The isolated Russian proletariat in a backward country could not satisfy the needs of production either. It could not satisfy them on a socialist basis. This was the quintessential point made by Trotsky in his theory of the permanent revolution. It was with this conviction in mind that Trotsky combated the bureaucracy's theory of, quote, socialism in a single country, end quote. The bureaucracy won, the revolution degenerated, but not in accordance with the predictions of Lenin or Trotsky. The revolution did not turn to capitalism, end quote. The reader, we think, is getting some idea of who it is that simply, quote, forgets to mention, end quote, the, quote, trifles, end quote. Let us continue. Quote, all modern nations, end quote, we noted, quote, experience the need for an economic organization and strength that will enable them to survive, end quote. The Russian bourgeoisie, however, was unable to develop the productive forces, an inability which conditioned its social impotence and triumph of the Russian Revolution under the hegemony of the proletariat. A contrary view is a capitulation to Menshevism, end parenthesis. The proletariat in turn was able to develop the productive forces, in Trotsky's words, make possible a, quote, authentic rise of a socialist economy, end quote, only with the state aid of the victorious Western proletariat. A contrary view is a capitulation to Stalinism, end parenthesis. The old prediction said, without the world revolution, Russia will inevitably stagnate and then succumb to capitalism in the form of foreign imperialist exploitation. Also, Stalinism is turning the country in that direction. The prediction, however understandable, was erroneous. A tremendous economic advance was made under Stalin's, quote, planning, end quote. It was not a socialist advance. This prediction of Trotsky was absolutely borne out, but neither was it capitalist. It was not accomplished by restoring private ownership in the means of production and exchange or by abolishing the monopoly of foreign trade. The productive forces were not developed by way of socialization, parenthesis, which implies a trend towards socialism, end parenthesis, but by way of bureaucratic collectivism. The new bureaucracy was born, grew, and took power in response not to the needs of society as a whole. The world proletariat is sufficiently capable of satisfying those, but to the organic needs of a backward, isolated country existing in unique and unprecedented world conditions. Let us temper the verdict with charity and say, Braverman, quote, simply forgets to mention, end quote, that Braverman wrote his review before reading the book. Impossible, the reader may protest. Impossible or not, the statement was the virtue of mercifully avoiding the right name for Braverman. 2. For Lenin, the rule of the class is determined only by the relationship to property. Shachtman, however, tries to get around this by arguing that, quote, this is a quote, Jesus Christ, that, quote, his new class, end quote, establishes no new property forms of its own and does not have property relations, but the ownership of political power as its fundament. I guess that's a quote. End quote. That looks bad, but only if there lingers in you a faith that Franco understands what he reads, or even reads what he reviews and condemns. It does not look so bad when you understand that the rule of the class is determined in the same way in Lenin's conception and in Shachtman's. Shachtman wrote in The Struggle for the New Course, quote, is the ABC of Marxism that the fundament of all social relations, parenthesis, that is, relations of production, end parenthesis, are property relations. That holds for the old slaveholding societies, for feudal society, for capitalist society, and for the proletarian state, end quote. Quote, how, end quote, asked Braverman, quote, does Shachtman get around, end quote, Lenin's conception? Very simply, by sharing it. But it is necessary to know what conception it is we share. Lenin speaks of property relations, of the relationship of a class to property, that is, to the means of production and exchange. Let us present a little more of the speech by Lenin at the 9th Congress of the Russian Party in 1920, from which Frankel takes his quotations. When the question of property was decided in practice, the rule of the class was thereby assured. Thereupon the Constitution wrote down on paper what life has decided. Quote, there is no capitalist in landed property, end quote. And it added, quote, the working class has more rights than the peasantry, but the exploiters have no rights at all, end quote. Therewith was written down the manner in which we realized the role of our class, in which we bound together the toilers of all strata of all the little groups, end quote. Quote, the rule of class is determined only by the relationship to property. That is precisely what determines the Constitution, and our Constitution correctly sets down our attitude to property and our attitude to the question of what class must stand at the head, end quote. Quote, and it added, end quote, what Frankel failed to add. The working class has more rights than the peasantry, but the exploiters have no rights at all. Quote, therewith was written down the manner in which we realize the rule of our class, end quote. Class rule is determined only by the relationship to property. Quote, our Constitution correctly sets down our attitude to property and our attitude to the question of what class must stand at the head, end quote. Today the working class does not have, quote, more rights than the peasantry, end quote. The capitalist exploiters have no rights at all in the Stalinist state, but neither have the workers or the peasants. The working class does not, quote, stand at the head, end quote. It is in the prison house that so Braverman says, Stalin has made out of Russia. In Russia in 1917, the proletariat first took political power. Then the proletariat in power, quote, did abolish property and abolished it completely, end quote. The, quote, rule of the class was thereby assured, end quote. The Constitution then gave the proletariat ruling rights. It provided that the proletariat, quote, must stand at the head, end quote. The means of production and exchange became the property of the workers' state. The setting up of a new class state by the Stalinist counter-revolution was accomplished by wiping all this out, by establishing fundamentally different property relations. All wiped out. This is where Braverman I'm confused by what's like a quote here, because it's like has block text, but there's no fucking formatting. Oh, no, I have to repeat that whole paragraph. I'm going to assume it's not a quote. In Russia in 1917, the proletariat first took power. Then the proletariat in power, quote, did abolish property and abolished property completely, end quote. The, quote, rule of the class was thereby assured, end quote. The Constitution then gave the proletariat ruling rights. It provided that the proletariat, quote, must stand at the head, end quote. The means of production and exchange became the property of the workers' state. The setting up of a new class state by the Stalinist counter-revolution was accomplished by wiping all this out, by establishing fundamentally different property relations. All wiped out? This is where Braverman is baffled. Isn't it a fact that property is still nationalized, still state property? Do not the property forms set up by the Bolshevik Revolution still remain? Isn't it a fact that, quote, the abolition of the old (capitalist) property forms sufficed for Lenin, end quote? And that these old forms have not yet been restored by the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy? Here we approach the nub of the problem. The, quote, abolition of the old property forms, end quote, would not have, quote, sufficed for Lenin, end quote, if these forms, capitalist private property, had burned out in a fire, inundated in a storm, or bombed into rubble by flying fortresses. The abolition sufficed because the abolition was accomplished by the proletariat in power, which converted capitalist property into the property of a proletarian state. By this action, the proletarian state completed, parenthesis, the first stage of, end parenthesis, the transformation not only of the old property relations. What is the meaning of this distinction between, quote, forms and, quote, relations? Does it exist in reality, or is it purely verbal? Under capitalism, property exists in the form of capitalist private property. This simple sentence already shows what are the property relations under capitalism. Regardless of the political regime, parenthesis, be it monarchical, democratic, militarist, fascist, or even semi-feudal, and parenthesis, be it monarchical, democratic, militarist, fascist, or even semi-feudal, end parenthesis, the capitalist class owns the property, parenthesis, means of production, etc., end parenthesis, and the proletariat works, as Marx would say, quote, with conditions of labor belonging to another, end quote. That is how we find the relationships of the classes to property. The state exists to maintain these relationships. The minute, therefore, you say, quote, capitalist property forms, end quote, you've already said, quote, capitalist property relations, end quote. Similarly, under slavery and feudalism, and in general wherever property is privately owned, the class that owns the property is the ruling class. But what about the society in which property is not privately but state-owned? Trotsky wrote about the Stalinist bureaucracy that, quote, the very fact of the Stalinist bureaucracy's appropriation of political power in a country where the principal means of production are in the hands of the state creates a new and hitherto unknown relation between the bureaucracy and the riches of the nation, end quote. Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. Let us re-emphasize a new and hitherto unknown relation. This thought, however, needs supplementation. The seizure of political power by the proletariat in a country where it turns over the principal means of production to the hands of the state also creates a new and hitherto unknown relation between the rulers and the property. For the third time, we emphasize a new and hitherto unknown relation. Why new? Why hitherto unknown? Because the proletariat's revolution, and the social order whose establishment is its historic mission, differ fundamentally from all preceding classes, the revolutions and their social orders. The proletariat is not a property-owning class under capitalism, and the proletariat does not become a property-owning class when the proletariat takes power. When the proletariat takes power, or state power, the proletariat turns the property over to its state. The proletariat's relations to property are then expressed only through its state. The proletariat, quote, owns, end quote, the property only inasmuch as the proletariat rules the property-owning state. That is the only way the proletariat ever did own property, ever will own property, and can ever own property. It owns it through its state, the worker state, through its political power. That is why there is such lamentable ignorance in the sarcastic question, quote, since when did a ruling class have for its fundament not property relations but the ownership of political power? Are the fascists a new ruling class? Is an absolute monarch a new ruling class? End quote. No, the monarch was not a ruling class. The feudal lords were, because they owned the landed property. The fascists are not a ruling class. The bourgeoisie is, because the bourgeoisie owns the means of production and exchange. The proletariat, however, is not merely, quote, another, end quote, class, but a fundamentally different class. It does not and cannot own property. It can only, quote, own, end quote, the state when it takes power. By that, quote, ownership, end quote, it establishes state property which it organizes and operates so that it ceases to be state property and becomes social property. The state itself ceases to be. The complete expropriation of the political power of the working class by the Stalinist bureaucracy only makes this point clearer. The property forms seem to be the same as they were before. Property exists in the form of state property. Therefore, cries Braverman triumphantly, it is still a worker state even if politically degenerated. But hold on a moment. What are now the property relations in Russia? That is, what are the relations of the various classes, parenthesis, or let us say the various social groups, end parenthesis, to the state property? We have been told by Lenin through Braverman that the rule of the class is determined only by the relationship to property. Granted, but just how shall we determine what the relationship is? In a society where property is privately owned, the question answers itself. This class, parenthesis, or social group, end parenthesis, owns the property. This class does not. Such an answer is obviously impossible in a society where property is not privately owned but state-owned. To determine when the relations to property of the various social groups, to determine then the relations to property of the various social groups, is it not clear that we must first find out what are their respective relations to the state which owns the property? Quote, from the point of view of property, bracket, in ownership of, end bracket, the means of production, quote, from the point of view of property in, bracket, ownership of, end bracket, the means of production, end quote, wrote Trotsky. Quote, the differences between a marshal and a servant girl, the head of a trust and a day laborer, the son of a people's commissar and a homeless child, seem not to exist at all, end quote. Trotsky, Revolution Betrayed. That's just the point. Although Trotsky did not draw the right conclusion. If you look at Russia from the standpoint of ownership of the means of production, in the same way you look at society in which these are privately owned, the trust head and the laborer have exactly the same property relations. Yet in reality, the respective relations to property are as fundamentally different as the respective relations to property of the bourgeois and the proletarian under capitalism, parenthesis, except that in Russia the gap between the classes is so much greater, end parenthesis. The bureaucracy is the ruling class. The bureaucracy has all the political power. The proletariat has none. That is why Frankel, Braverman's, quote, irony, end quote, about Shachtman, because Shachtman, quote, points not to the foundation but to the political superstructure, end quote, is so utterly out of place. Braverman does not understand the historically unprecedented nature of the proletarian state power, the peculiarity of the proletariat as a ruling class. He does not understand what is unprecedented about the class rule of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Frankel Braverman derides its, quote, ownership of, quote, political power, end quote, as something quite secondary, because he cannot grasp the simple idea that where property belongs to the state, the, quote, ownership, end quote, of the state power means the monopolization of all economic and social power. The bureaucracy is the ruling class because the bureaucracy's, quote, mere, end quote, political power makes the bureaucracy the owner of the conditions of production. It is always the relation of the owners of the conditions of production to the actual producers that shows us the real basis of a class society and establishes the true class character of the state. The Stalinist state is no exception to this rule. This is the nub of the problem, we said. Without understanding this essentially simple idea, the Stalinist counter-revolution will remain an enigma and a source of confusion. We wrote that our criticism of Trotsky's theory, quote, introduces into it an indispensable correction, end quote. The key to this correction is given by Trotsky. If we quote Trotsky himself, this may be of help to Braverman, whose Marxism consists in Lenin's excellent phrase of, quote, swearing by God, end quote. In The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky shows how bourgeois society has maintained bourgeois society's self and developed in spite of different political regimes and bureaucratic castes. In contrast to this, the property relations which issued from the socialist revolution are indivisibly bound up with the new state as their repository. The predominance of socialist over petty bourgeois tendencies is guaranteed not by the automatism of the economy, we are still far from that, but by political measures taken by the dictatorship. The character of the economy as a whole thus depends on the character of the state power, end quote. Trotsky, Revolution Betrayed. Our whole difference with this basically unassailable statement of the problem lies in the fact that we draw the consistent conclusion The new state is the repository of the property relations and is indivisibly bound up with the property relations. The character of the economy depends upon the character of the state power, and that in contrast to bourgeois society. Once this is understood, the rest follows. It is this conception that lay at the heart of Trotsky's first theory of Russia as a degenerated worker state. The state is the repository of the property relations. The character of the economy depends upon the character of the state power. In this first theory, Trotsky, as Braverman would put it, quote, pointed not to the foundations, but to the political superstructure, end quote. That is why Trotsky used to repeat and repeat that Russia is still a worker state because the political power can be reformed. Quote, that the proletariat of the USSR has not forfeited the possibility of submitting the bureaucracy to it, of reviving the party and mending the regime of the dictatorship without a new revolution with the methods on the road of reform, end quote. That's Trotsky from Problems of the Development of the USSR. That would have been before Trotsky's view that the Comintern and Stalinist Russia were no longer reformable, which I think takes place like after the Nazi seizure of power. I think that was like the final straw for Trotsky in terms of like, okay, like the Comintern and the Stalinist bureaucracy are not just like superficially rotten, but substantially rotten, and it's necessary to work towards building a counter-international and create and fight for a political revolution in the Soviet Union itself against Stalin and the bureaucracy. So I think that's from an earlier piece. With the abandonment of the program of reform and the adoption of the view that the Stalinist bureaucracy can be overthrown only by a revolution, Trotsky was compelled also to abandon his first theory and to develop an altogether different theory, namely, Russia is still a workers' state because property is still nationalized. This complete change has been demonstrated by us in detail and in several places, including the struggle for the new course. Frankel just acts as if he never heard of the point. His silence encourages the belief that our demonstration is irrefutable. The second theory of Trotsky is radically different from the first. Originally, the state was a repository of the property relations. Now the, quote, property relations, end quote, parenthesis, nationalized property, end parenthesis, are the, quote, repository, end quote, of the state. Originally, the character of the economy was determined by the character of the state power. Parenthesis, Frankel's, quote, political superstructure, end quote, end parenthesis. Now, the character of the state power is determined by the character of the economy. If you understand and hold to the first and only correct conception of Trotsky, you understand why the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, in conquering state power and establishing the counter-revolutionary bureaucracy's self as the new ruling class, did not need, quote, to abolish previous property forms or institute new ones of its own, end quote, at least not in appearance. By completing its conquest of state power, the bureaucracy established new property relations. Thereby, parenthesis, will Frankel, Braverman, ever understand this, end parenthesis, the bureaucracy established property forms of the bureaucracy's own, if by that is meant social property forms. When the proletariat was in power, property existed and was exploited in Russia in the form of property of the workers' state. With Stalinism in complete power, property existed and is exploited in the form of property of the bureaucratic collectivist state. Stalinism has wiped out all the conquest of the proletarian revolution. The trouble with Frankel at bottom is that Frankel accepts and his party repeatedly disseminates the fundamental sophism of the Stalinist doctrine, which in the new Russian constitution legalizes the lie that state property equals, quote, the possession of the whole people, end quote. 3. A ruling class without a past and without a future? In a terse but all the more devastating reply, Braverman says, quote, such tripe is, according to Shachtman, quote, the veriest commonplace of Marxism, end quote, end quote. Neither the commonplaces nor the complexities of Marxism are made up of tripe. This we will grant, but only if we are allowed to add that discussions of Marxism should not be made up of forgeries. In the chapter on the bureaucracy as a new ruling class, Shachtman analyzes the hopes... Again, is this a fucking quote? I don't know. In the chapter on the bureaucracy as a new ruling class, Shachtman analyzes the hopeless contradiction into which Trotsky's theory drove him in 1939 when he presented us with a proletarian revolution carried out in Russian-occupied Poland by the, quote, counter-revolutionary workers' state, end quote. Parenthesis, brave Frankel, Braverman, like his friends, has not one word to say in defense of Trotsky on this point, end parenthesis. At the end of his analysis, Shachtman writes that, quote, in comparison with this or that, our theory of the Stalinist bureaucracy is a new and reactionary exploitative class, and of Russia as a bureaucratic collectivist state, neither proletarian nor bourgeois, is the veriest commonplace of Marxism, end quote. Several pages later, at the end of the volume, Shachtman writes in an entirely different connection about, quote, the new bureaucracy, without a past and without a future, end quote, end quote. I'm guessing that, I don't know, it seemed like a lot of that was just, that was what Frankel was saying. I don't know, but it's not clear. Frankel, who belongs to the, or Braverman, who belongs to the, quote, only moral people, end quote, simply cuts away the couple of thousand words that separate the two quotations, pastes together the two unrelated clauses with a little trip, and passes it off on the public as a genuine check written, quote, according to Shachtman, end quote. Following right after this clumsy little forgery appears a subheading over another one of Frankel's stern indictments of us. It reads, parenthesis, oh coincidence, exclamation point, and parenthesis, quote, a petty bourgeois counterfeit, end quote. The only comment this requires is 2 punctuation marks, exclamation point, exclamation point. However, we did speak of the Stalinist bureaucracy as being without a past and without a future. It is a question that is best dealt with insofar as it can be adequately treated in an article in connection with the final point raised, parenthesis, i.e. muddled up, end parenthesis, by Braverman. Quote, according to Marxists, the historical justification for every ruling class is the ability, under its particular system of exploitation, to raise the development of productive forces of society as a whole to a new level. Does Shachtman grant this ability to Stalinism, i.e. his own, quote, new exploitative class, end quote, ... end quote. I'm guessing this is, quote, again, another quote. Quote, the gist of Shachtman's 128-page argument boils down to a presentation of the crimes of Stalinism as the birth pangs that mark the rise of a new class to power. No more, no less. It is an elementary principle of Marxism that ruling classes rise in society through the operation of forces beyond the control of men's consciousness, reason, or will. The rise of new ruling classes can be retarded or facilitated, but never prevented, until and unless these classes have exhausted their historic mission. In the light of this, what is Shachtman's version of the evolution of the Soviet Union, if not an attempt to supply a historical justification, not for the ascendancy of a new class, but actually the abominations of the Kremlin? Ex un leonem, you know the lion by his claws. Another species of animal, however, you know by its bray. From the braying, we gather that Shachtman is not only trying to provide a historical justification for Stalinism, quote, but actually for the abominations of the Kremlin, end quote. Obviously a detestable creature, this Shachtman. Much deeper he cannot sink. Again, I'm not sure if that's a quote or not. I actually don't think that last little bit was a quote. However, if we fumigate the air a little and reflect a little, things look more cheerful. In the first place, the two accusations are in conflict. Shachtman says the bureaucracy has no past and no future, and he gives the bureaucracy a historical justification. If it is historically justified, it has both a historical past and a historical future. In the second place, Shachtman nowhere speaks of a historical justification of the Stalinist bureaucracy. In the second place, Stalin nowhere speaks of a historical justification of Stalinism, nor does Shachtman suggest that it has one. Here we have not a forgery, but an invention. And in the third place, the only one in our movement who ever spoke of a historical justification of the Stalinist bureaucracy was Leon Trotsky. As in the case of the definition of a trade union, Frankel, Braverman, does not know where Trotsky ends and where Shachtman begins, parenthesis, this is his only qualification for writing on either one of them, end parenthesis. On December 28, 1934, Trotsky wrote, quote, "Indeed, the historical justification for the very existence of the bureaucracy is lodged in the fact that we are still very far removed from socialist society," end quote. Parenthesis, the Kirov assassination, end parenthesis. Further, Trotsky notes that the Stalinist dictatorship is both a heritage of past class struggles and an instrument for preventing a new class struggle. Quote, "In this and in this alone rests the historical justification for the existence of the present Soviet dictatorship," end quote. Trotsky, the Kirov assassination. Again, in the same work, quote, It would be criminal to deny the progressive work accomplished by the Soviet bureaucracy," end quote. Parenthesis, this Trotsky pamphlet was translated by J.G. Wright. Wright is editor of the Fourth International. Without a murmur, he prints Braverman's ignorant and venomous observations on, quote, "historical justification," end quote. What does it matter? Who will read the answer to it? Is it against the, quote, "petty bourgeois opposition," end quote? Is it true and harsh and tough and vicious? Well, so much the better. That's how we rough and tumble proletarians, parenthesis, i.e. J.G. Wright, i.e. Harry Frankel, Harry Braverman, and Joseph Hansen, end parenthesis, right, and if you don't like it, you can lump it, let's print it, damn it all, end parenthesis. In a sense, we are able to accept Trotsky's characterization of the bureaucracy. That is why we are able to speak of the new class without a past and without a future, that is, without a historical past or future. If Frankel, Braverman, had resisted his penchant for tearing phrases out of those phrases' context, the meaning would have been clearer. We say the Stalinist bureaucracy is a new ruling class because the Stalinist bureaucracy is the, quote, "owner of the conditions of production," end quote. Despite similarities in certain aspects with other class societies, parenthesis, the capitalists, for example, end parenthesis, the Stalinist bureaucracy differs basically from all of them in the Stalinist bureaucracy's own unique mode of production, in the, quote, "specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producers," end quote, in the distribution of the means of production and of the products of economy. As a result of unforeseen historical circumstances, it arose out of, quote, "the needs of production," end quote. It did develop the productive forces in a way that no other class could under the given conditions. We say this class is without a past. We seek thereby to distinguish this class from the great and durable classes of history which for various objective reasons, parenthesis, economic, geographic, etc., end parenthesis, went through a long evolution and decisively directed the course of social development. What Frankel says about, quote, "every ruling class," end quote, is true only in a manner of speaking, that is, with the necessary historical limitations. In other words, it is not true as an absolutely valid dogma. History is studded with records of classes under whose rule society stagnated and which could not be fitted into Frankel's rigid formula. Whoever does not know this had better rush to a serious history before he even pretends to speak about Marxism. Marxism does not say that the world and everything in the world marches straight forward from primitive communism to slavery, then to feudalism, then to capitalism, then to the proletarian dictatorship and communism, with no reversions, side leaps, combinations, or, quote, "oddities," end quote, whatsoever. This is an utterly primitive conception of Marxism. Quote, "My critic," end quote, wrote Marx to the Russian populist Danielson, quote, "must needs metamorphose my outline of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historic philosophical theory of the general course, fatally imposed upon all peoples, regardless of the historical circumstances in which they find themselves placed, in order to arrive finally at that economic formation which ensures, with the greatest amount of productive power of social labor, the most complete development of man. But I beg his pardon. He does me too much honor and too much shame at the same time. ... Strikingly, analogical events occurring, however, in different historical environments (lead) to entirely dissimilar results. By studying each of these evolutions separately and then comparing them, one will easily find the key to these phenomena. But one will never succeed with the master key of a historico-philosophical theory whose supreme virtue consists in being supra-historical. End quote. Marx. Marx often repeated the same thought. All classes and all ruling classes are not the same and do not always have the same characteristics. All classes and all ruling classes cannot be measured by the same criteria. The same obviously holds true of all societies, for in each society, as Marx points out, the quote, prevailing element, end quote, is a different one. To apply the same criteria to the present ruling class and the present social order in Russia, as is applied, for example, to feudalism, simply makes no sense from the Marxian or any other standpoint. Quote, by studying each of these evolutions separately and then comparing them, one will easily find the key to these phenomena. End quote. This is what we have sought to do in our analysis of Stalinist Russia. A supra-historical master key does not exist. Even a thinker of Harry Braverman's stature can, if we may say so, forge one. We say further that this new class has no future. Why? Because it arose at the stage of the final decay and crisis of class society. It has given no sign of an ability to resolve the crisis which the combined forces of world capitalism have failed to resolve. The bureaucracy is historically conditioned by the concrete circumstances of the bureaucracy's origin. One of these circumstances is the existence of the bureaucracy's origin. One of these circumstances is the existence of a modern proletariat which, on a world scale, but not on a national scale, is capable of breaking the fetters on productive forces, on social development, on freedom, and thus resolving the last social crisis of humanity. That is how it stands historically. Theoretically, it is conceivable that this new class may have a, quote, future, end quote, and that on a world scale. Such a perspective might open up if this new class, for example, such a perspective might open up for the new class if, for example, what the fuck? Oh, you bitch. Fuck. Sorry, my computer just died because I had it plugged in, but I didn't have it plugged into the right place. I had it plugged into a extension cord that wasn't plugged into the wall. So now I have to get back to where I was, and hopefully that's not too hard. You have to bear with me because it's like the last page. I'm not starting a new recording for the last page. I was like right at the end of it. There's like a few more sentences left. And I was so close. But I'm an idiot and I have to pay for my idiocy. Alright, I think I was on page 240. $241. Okay, where was I? That is how it stands historically. Theoretically, it is conceivable that this new class may have, quote, a future, end quote, and that on a world scale. Such a perspective might open up for this new class if, for example, it was conclusively demonstrated that the proletariat is organically incapable of resolving the crisis, of taking and holding power and employing it to inaugurate a classless society. Nothing of the sort has yet been demonstrated, much less demonstrated conclusively. There are some dilettantes and ex-radicals who confine themselves to just such speculations and even make them their program of, quote, action, end quote. We, for our part, find little interest in them and less need for them. Our task is the mobilization of the working class for the revolutionary assault against decaying capitalism. Our task is not ponderation over the growth, end quote, future, end quote, of Stalinism, but the struggle against Stalinism for the future of the proletariat. Successful struggle against a foe requires an understanding of this foe's nature. That Harry Braverman and Harry Braverman's like do not understand is already bad. That Harry Braverman and his like refuse to understand, and a precondition of understanding is intelligent and loyal discussion, be it ever so vigorous, is worse. Braverman is only a minor epigon of Trotsky. Trotsky's whole new course is an instructive protest against the type of methods, outlook, procedure that Frankl and Frankl's friends represent. Braverman and Braverman's friends represent. That is why Braverman speaks so cavalierly of Trotsky's work. That is why Braverman does not give the reader as much as an inkling of Trotsky's work's contents. We have already suggested that Braverman does not know much, but Braverman knows enough to see that what Trotsky wrote in 1923-24 is a timely and thorough indictment of what he stands for. In this sense, a reading of the new course may be recommended all over again as an excellent preparation for a fruitful discussion of, quote, the Russian question, end quote. Again, that's the end of the piece, and again, it was from August 1944 and October 1944 in New International, and it was titled, what was it titled? Stalinist state property defines a new exploitative class society. Okay. So that is the end of Chapter 7. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day or evening or lifetime or, I don't know, eternity.